Hey, everybody. I got a great episode here today. We have a guest on by the name of Dr. Drew out of Oklahoma City. I'm just recording this after the fact of talking with Dr. Drew. I wanted to kind of tease a little bit of the back end of this podcast. We get into a really, really interesting conversation about how he actually had his own 12-year-old son purchase a rental property as kind of this financial learning experiment. And he talks about how he did all this and what has come of it. And I really wanted to emphasize that at the beginning of this episode because we're going to have kind of some more of the, opening kind of dialogue and talking about his real estate experience. But I think a lot of people will get a lot out of that. So what we'll do is we'll roll into the intro music that I have grown to love so much. And we're going to get right into the podcast, but I wanted to just kind of tease that here at the front. So looking forward to having you guys tune into this one. Really great guy, even gives his information out at the end if you want to contact him for any kind of mentorship or anything like that. So it's a pretty cool offer from somebody who's doing pretty well with real estate. So let's get to it.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. You got Eric here in the Rent Prep offices. Steve is off of this episode, but we have a really great guest, and I'm excited to have this guest on for a few reasons. We were talking before we got on the podcast here. One of the main reasons, which he doesn't know yet, is that it rhymes really well with the podcast episode. So, Dr. Drew, I'd like to welcome you to episode 222. How you doing?
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah, we got all sorts of things going on here because Tim Shiner, a friend of the podcast, he's been on a couple times. He teed up this podcast for us. He's like, you got to have Dr. Drew on your podcast. He has some really interesting stories on what he's been doing with real estate. And one of the things he wrote in his email in very Tim-like fashion, he said he went from ER to RE. So tell us a little bit about your background. So you're an ER doctor, correct?
I am. And I'll say that Tim is definitely a hard act to follow. That guy is just amazing and always has just great bits of advice. But yes, I'm 43 years old. I'm an emergency medicine physician in Oklahoma City. I got out of residency in 2005 and have been practicing since that time.
So I got to ask, not to get sidetracked, I like to do this. Is your type of position, do you deal with the patients directly a lot, or is it like kind of an emergency room situation where it's like really fast and like you're not having a lot of correspondence with them?
It's more like the latter. So it is emergency medicine. And so I spent about 6 years right out of residency at the Level 1 Trauma Center here. And, of course, that's fast paced. It's a crazy environment. You came home with an interesting story every shift. Mm-hmm. There's always something interesting going on. The past several years, our group, which is actually a large nationwide company now, took over the heart hospital contracts here in Oklahoma City. So most people don't realize that a lot of the specialty hospitals have emergency departments. So they each have a 15-bed ER, and we may not be as fast-paced, but we see lots of really sick patients, as you can imagine, with cardiovascular disease. And so it's still emergency medicine. It's still just a brief period with the patient, but it's direct action.
Okay. All right. That's helpful to know just kind of what you do. And I mean, that's a pretty interesting lifestyle for sure. Before we hopped on the podcast, you were saying that one of the things that your job lends to is the fact that you kind of work more unusual hours than somebody who does the 9 to 5, right?
Absolutely. So we do 12-hour shifts. The beauty is we're the type of doctors that aren't on call. We don't have to worry about the medicine when we're not there, but we also do work nights and holidays. I just got off of 4 days, was off yesterday, and I'm going back to night shifts tomorrow night. So it's always changing, and it just kind of, just keeps your mind rolling. Half the time my wife says it's like talking to a zombie because I don't know if it's night or day and what day is it again?
So you have this job, which, it's a higher earning job. You've got kind of these unusual hours. So eventually you start getting to real estate. Like, how did that come about? Like, why did you get into real estate as opposed to, just maybe going on the golf course and spending your money that you're making with all the free time you have?
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we, as physicians, as long as you manage your money, I mean, we could have a wonderful living the rest of our lives. But one thing that you and I talked about before we started was that I grew up from a very modest background. We certainly weren't hurting, but we didn't have a lot of excess as far as money goes. My parents taught me to do basic finances as far as balance a checkbook and things like that and limit debt. However, their idea of investing was certificates of deposit. And so as we went through school, we didn't really get much business background. There's just not much of that taught in the medical system. And so I knew coming out of residency that I was going to start making a pretty generous income and needed something to do with that. And as I started getting courted, they court us with financial advisors when we're residents, and started meeting with these financial advisors, and just ultimately didn't feel like I trusted those guys. They all seemed like they were trying to sell me a product. And whenever I'd ask them, where are you at on the wealth spectrum? Nobody would tell me. And so I just didn't feel safe there. So I started doing research, looked, and then ultimately kind of said, most of the wealthy people at least are in some capacity involved in real estate. So as I kind of unpacked that and dug into it, there's multiple facets of that. And I just kind of buy and hold sounded like what I needed to do for wealth creation. Because really my idea was I wanted something for retirement at that time. That's what I thought. Mm. And so my wife and I bought about 7 single family properties from about 2006 until about 2 years ago. And then at that point, I just kind of become disenchanted with medicine, and everybody is with their job, but there's just lots of other things going on with that I thought if I ever want to be able to do medicine on my own terms and maybe do more charity work, the things where I'm not just required to be nights and weekends and holidays, then real estate is the option for me. And so we started looking at our real estate investing more as a business, and we just really started to ramp it up about 2 years ago.
Okay. So was there any kind of shift in the way that you were investing because of that? Because obviously if you're starting out and you're investing in buy and hold strategies for the long-term thinking retirement, but now you're thinking, I want to start, potentially changing my current lifestyle before retirement or early retirement, right? Did you do any kind of like major shifts in the way that you were investing because of that?
I did. Absolutely. When we first started buying, other than just not being as efficient as we could be, and by that I mean, I just didn't really network, because to find the better deals, you've got to get out there and let people know that that's what you do and become more involved as far as networking. But so we bought probably closer to retail than we should. And we also put them on shorter term debt. So typically I had 12 or 15 year notes, because my thought was I wanted to pay these off as quick as possible. And I didn't need the cash flow today. So if I can get these paid off, then I thought I was going to be sitting pretty. Well, whenever I started looking at it more from a business perspective and talking to other investors like Tim and guys that were just where I wanted to be, they taught me, that that's not the best use of your money. And when you look at your returns on your investment, there's lots of better ways to go about that. And so we restructured our debt. They're on 30-year notes, most of them, almost all of them actually. And so it improves the cash flow. But we take that cash flow and generally infuse it back into the business. So again, still not trying to live on the cash flow, but it does hedge against problems with expenditures and things like that. And it's allowed us to exponentially grow our business.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think we talked to, and maybe you're friends with him as well, Josh Randall. Does that ring a bell?
No.
Well, he's a friend of Tim Shiner's as well, but he kind of talks about the fact that he would finish paying off his mortgage on his home, and his wife would be like, "You're crazy," because he'd immediately go out to leverage his home to purchase other rental properties as soon as he finished paying it off. Because he's like, "Look, like that's the equity that we have, and if you're just sitting there on 12-year, 15-year notes like you're talking about when you're getting started, you're kind of tying up more of your funds into the rental properties, right? Then rather than having extra cash to be able to play with to potentially go out and get more rental properties."
Absolutely. Equity looks great on paper, and it is needed, but it doesn't make me money when I can be using it in more appropriate ways, if that makes sense.
Okay. Just curious. So you said that you started meeting people, you started networking kind of to get some of those better deals. And then eventually you met Tim Shiner and some other people. What kind of networking were you doing to get involved in your real estate scene? And were you investing just mainly in Oklahoma City in your local area, or?
Yeah, just Oklahoma City and some of the surrounding metro areas. Now I have some properties in Arkansas, and as I've ventured into multifamily into some larger areas like Dallas and Charlotte, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did is no one knew that I bought properties. And it occurred to me as I was talking to someone at work, and they said, "Oh, I had no idea you had rent homes." And I thought, well, that's something that needs to change. So I didn't want to be the guy on Facebook saying, I'm buying this house or that house, but you do need to get it out there that you're an investor. And that's something I tell people that come to me that I work with now or try to help is, start from day one, telling people you're an investor. You may feel like a phony, but what it does is it lets them know that if they come across something, they should talk to you or at least run it by you. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing that, started going to every real estate investor meetup that I could that was in our local area, or at least regionally, like Dallas is only 3 hours down the road. So things like that. Got more involved on Bigger Pockets, more involved in the different kind of social media channels, and just tried to immerse myself in it and put it out there that actually that's what I do. And most of the time people, outside of that have no idea that I do medicine unless it comes up. But it's just, I introduce myself as a real estate investor.
Okay. And could you give us an example of maybe like a deal that you think maybe came from the fact that you were putting it out there, that you're a real estate investor, as opposed to just going a traditional route and logging on Zillow or something to see what homes are for sale?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple will come to mind. One is just at one of the local meetings that we have at a restaurant here in town. One of the ladies there they're getting closer to retirement, want to start slowly selling off their portfolio. We were just casually talking. She said, "Hey, I have this property that's for sale." And I said, "Where is it?" It was by some of the other ones that I owned. And I said, "I know that area." So we went and looked at it, and the deal worked out, and it's been a remarkable deal. Another one is, as I mentioned, I don't want to take social media and make it all about the business, but I do occasionally mention, "Hey, we purchased some properties. If you know of anything, send it my way." And I had an acquaintance I met several years ago, and we just kept up on Facebook. And she sent me a package of 6 houses that her and her husband had acquired, and they were moving to Alaska, so they wanted to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And so far, that's been my best cash-on-cash return. So it's just things like that. The more, it's the more you work at it, the better your luck becomes, sort of thing. The more you start involving yourself in the education and the networking, it just seems like the more those deals come across your desk.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's nice to get those kind of real world examples for our listeners who maybe haven't gone to that extent of saying, you know what, I'm going to treat this like a business and let people know that I'm, open for business. Yeah. So before we got on the podcast, and, I'll probably tease this at the beginning with an introduction on this podcast, we were talking about a pretty unusual circumstance where you got involved on a rental property where you had your son, who I believe you said was 12 years old, actually was the one who was spearheading the property and purchasing a rental property?
No, that's exactly right. So kind of the story on that is whenever our boys were born, we started investing in a dividend reinvestment program for them, or plan. And for your listeners that may not know what that is, stocks that pay dividends frequently have plans that are administered through the company or a third-party administration company, and allows you to buy stock without going through a brokerage, and typically at a discount. And whenever those stocks pay dividends, they reinvest that at a discount. So it's kind of a compounding effect. And so we started with friends and family and said, "Hey, if you guys are thinking about giving a gift for a holiday, can you give a little bit to their fund and a gift that's smaller?" Because they didn't need stuff. And so most everybody was on board with that. And we also made it automatic, which is another thing I would tell your listeners, is if you're planning an investment plan, do everything you can to make it automatic. That way it's getting done. And so we took and just started initially with $50 that would get drafted every month into this account. And by the time the boys were turning into their teens, they had about $20,000 in these accounts. Mm-hmm. They knew that they couldn't touch it till they were 18. And they would always look at it and watch it grow, and they were excited by it, but it wasn't tangible. They knew they couldn't touch it until they were adults. We were going on a vacation. My middle son, who was 12 at the time, he's now 13, is very much a reader. He loves to read, but he typically read fantasy books. And I said, "Hey, Cooper, what if I pay you $50 to read a book that I choose?" And he thought about it and he said, okay, I'll do it. I said, but you have to be able to have a reasonable conversation about the book after the fact. So I gave him Rich Dad, Poor Dad for teens. Of course, I had to read the book as well. So we went on vacation. We were driving back home. He had finished the book and I was amazed. He could talk about liabilities, assets, depreciation, things that were covered in the book, to a level of a 12-year-old, but he understood it. And I thought, well, that's great. Maybe I'll continue to do this. But what happened is a week or so later, he came to me and said, hey, Dad, we always go with you whenever you buy these rent houses. Should I use some of my investment money and buy a rent house? And even though we'd kind of had a hard rule that money wasn't to be touched until they were 18 at least, to me, this was another version of investment and a good opportunity. So I said, absolutely. And so we started going to lunch. We would start going and driving for dollars. And I would involve him and have him call the realtors that were on the signs. We would talk about how to figure out the down payment that may be needed, how to calculate potential expenses. And, it took us several months, but by the end, he was able to kind of look at things and say, well, there's a crack above this doorway, Dad. Do you think there's structural issues? Things like that. And the realtors would start talking to me and I'd say, no, that's your buyer right there. Talk to him. And they did. And it also, for a shy kid, it also helped him to kind of come out of that and improve his communication skills. So we found a HUD property that ultimately, once it went out of owner-occupant status at the 30-day mark, we were able to put in a bid, and we got it. It was $55,000, I believe. It was a 3-bed, 2-bath in an area similar to some of our other properties, and it was a good purchase. He calculated his down payment and what kind of expenses, because it needed a central heat and air and a couple of other cosmetic things. I think he ended up spending about $17,000 or $18,000 out of his funds, but he cashed it. We took him out of school for the closing, and didn't make him read every closing doc, but they were awesome and explained a lot of it to him. And the one thing I will say, and I've had a few naysayers, but very few actually. It's usually people very interested, but we had talked to lawyers and they said, you could title it in his name as part of an LLC. But ultimately, the advice we got was to title it in our name and title it to him at 18. Okay. So he did use his money. It's in our name. But he still looks at it and, okay, this is my cash flow. And even though he wasn't allowed to touch that cash flow because it had to go back to replete his dividend reinvestment plan, he then started thinking about, well, if I want to buy this, how much cash flow would it take to do that? And so here we are about 18 months later, and we finally allowed him to take some of that. He wanted to buy a 3D printer. And so we ultimately said, okay, we'll take some of your cash flow and use it for that. Because really, you got to have some sort of tangible benefits for doing that. But he's ready. He wants to buy more, but it just doesn't have the cash to do it just yet. But he's still involved whenever we go and look. And so my other two sons, the youngest is kind of interested, but not quite to the level where I think he can understand it to truly do the process. And my 16-year-old would love to do it, but says, I'm not going to read that book. I don't want to learn that. And so, you know what? I'm not going to make him. It is what it is. He's learning a lot just by being, indirectly involved. But, you just got to kind of nurture what you can and try to help him have some financials.
Yeah. The most ironic thing that I got out of everything that you just said was that you said you took your son and you pulled him out of school to go to the closing. And I was like, you know what? The kid probably learned a heck of a lot more at closing about a lot of things than he would have for that, day of school. So.
Absolutely. And when I signed him out of school, we wrote on the reason going to buy my own house. Anyway, he wanted to write that on there and I was like, perfect, let's do it. So
you said he spent about $18,000 down on the property. So obviously he had to get a loan on it. How did you structure the loan? I mean, are you the name on the loan? Or is he the name on the loan?
It is.
Okay, gotcha.
It's us. Just for simplicity's sake.
Yeah.
But looking at the numbers, that property now rents for, I think, $850, maybe $900 now. I think we just increased the rent. The current value, of course, for what that's worth, it is just over $100,000. And so, looking at the numbers, it's been a good investment for him, and hopefully it'll be a good starting point for a career, or not a career, but at least this sort of thing. And the boys have asked me, and I've always been one to say, oh yeah, you should go to college and you should do this. And they say, well, what if we learn to do real estate and built up some cash flow and wealth that way? And I said, well, that's wonderful, but what if that would allow you to do a job that you could train for that you may not have otherwise thought you could do because of the amount it pays? What if you wanted to do something that you just weren't going to do because of that, but yet you could use real estate to open those opportunities? I said, don't think that you're not going to do things like that, but just think of it as an opportunity to expand those options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when they're starting that young too, I mean, the possibilities are even greater. I mean, any kind of investing, right? The younger you start, usually the better the returns are over time. Well, yeah, I've thought about this before, especially when I was in college. I had a friend's girlfriend who lived in this house, gorgeous house, brand new build, and she was I want to say a sophomore or maybe a junior when she moved into the house. And one of her roommates was actually it was her father's house. He had built it for her. And he looked at all the numbers of what these, student housing complexes were charging. And I know the one that I lived in was ridiculous. It was like something like $2,400, $2,500 or something a month for this tiny little apartment for 4 people. And he looked at the numbers and said, you know what, I can build something and probably get back better money and have a rental property.
Exactly.
So I remember thinking, because my dad was really into rental properties. Growing up, we spent a lot of our weekends, fixing something or going to the rental properties and working on them and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, like, I wish we did something like that when I was in college, because I blew through so many funds just paying for, overpriced rental properties in college. So you're kind of getting to that a little bit earlier, though, when he was 12.
Well, and we've talked about that as, because we have a couple state colleges around here that we've talked about. Well, should we look at maybe buying some property around that for just that reason, that the boys can look at doing that? And so haven't pursued that, but we've certainly talked about it. And I think it's a smart thing to do.
Yeah. What would you say is like your biggest takeaway? I mean, essentially what you've done is that you've created a giant experiment, right? There's not a lot of people who can say, yeah, we've purchased a rental property and we've done it with our son's funds. He's 12 years old and he's learning and he's actually the one helping facilitate the deals and talking to the realtors. I mean, what's your biggest takeaway from doing this?
I mean, I think the thing is just creating that sort of curiosity in them. I mean, every parent wants to do the best they can to raise their kid, wants to do the best they can to teach them about things. And so, finances are one of those things that I think it's Grant Cardone that says, everybody's afraid to talk about their money. And I think my parents were certainly that way. They never would tell me how much they made or how much money we had in any accounts. And not that that's a big deal, but I think now there's so much that I could learn from other people if they're willing to share. And there's nothing bad about it. Maybe some people don't want to talk because they feel like they're in too much debt or things like that. But I think by having those open conversations with your kids, and, whenever times are tight, we talk to the boys about that. Hey, you know what? We had to buy this or that for this, so we're not going to be able to spend as much money on, X. Mm-hmm. And so by being open with the kids about that, I think it's just made them a lot more cognizant of those things, and hopefully that'll carry over to adulthood. So, if that answers your question, but I think those are the things that it's like you said, it was just a project or an experiment to try to teach them some fundamentals of finance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you hit it earlier where you said, you went to med school and the amount of education that you're taking in during those years while you're doing that, and also through your residency. And you said that, they didn't even cover finances, right? So it's kind of interesting.
It's not at all.
Yeah. And it's such a huge part of everybody's life. I mean, to say it's not, you're either born with a golden spoon or you're just, broke if you're not paying attention to that at all. And it's just it's great that your son, your other sons are getting this education at such an early age, and that's awesome.
I appreciate that, and the other thing too is that I've I get a lot of people that say, okay, we were talking earlier about networking. And once I start telling people I'm an investor, and then we talk to them, and then somehow being a physician comes up and they go, well, I can't do that then because I don't have the money that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I know so many people that got into investing in real estate and had very little. And you do certainly have to be sometimes creative or partner with other people in the beginning and have a long-term goal, but it can absolutely be done. And we've tried to do a lot of it with doing the minimal amount of dipping into my W-2 income that we can.
Mm-hmm.
And just to prove the point, because whenever, I have a few people that, not truly a mentor or things like that, but they ask me advice and I'm always willing to help. And I show them numbers. And I absolutely am open with my books, everything from just our household finances to the way that the real estate impacts that, because their situation may be different, but maybe there's something there that they could learn. And I've even learned from them. And sometimes they point out, well, why are you doing that? And okay, you know what? Maybe that doesn't make sense. And that's something that medicine's taught me. And then doing this even more is that I can learn something from everybody, whether they are 10 steps ahead of me or 10 steps behind me. There's always something to be learned.
Yeah, that's a good outlook, I think, to have on life. And that's why I enjoy doing this podcast, because I get to have guests on like yourself where I can learn so much in such a quick, brief amount of time as you're going through everything. So that about wraps up this episode, I think. But Dr. Drew, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's so interesting getting the different insights from different investors and the way they're kind of coming about it and going through it, and especially the story of introducing it to your son at such an early age. I think that's really commendable, and it's an interesting takeaway for a lot of our listeners to kind of consider. And I know, my son's not a year old yet, so I'm not going to be talking to him about this anytime soon. But those are the things I think about too, where it's like you want to make sure that, your children have healthy, financial habits and are planning for their own futures too. So it's such an awesome way to do it.
Well, I appreciate that. And you're doing great things with the podcast, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, anytime.
And if any of your listeners want to reach out, I'm always happy to help and share my experiences, good and bad. And believe me, there's plenty of bad along with the good. So I'm more than happy to help. Okay.
I can throw something into the show notes too. What would be the best way for people to reach you if they're interested?
Yeah, my email is Drew, DREW, at sawridgecapital.com, SAWRIDGECAPITAL.com. I've recently expanded into multifamily syndications, and so that's our company for that. And then also do some blogging with the Passive Income Physician, and you could reach out to me via his blog as well. So happy to help in any way that I can.
Oh, that's a great offer for anyone listening, because I don't even think there's a sales pitch on the other side of it. So
no, there's not actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for being on the podcast and for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Eric.